that. So I'll be speaking to elements around tax revenues and the challenges, particularly in the extractive industries. My name is Mokopan Sendilka, and I'm the Policy Officer for Tax and Natural Resource Governance at the Tax Justice Network Africa. Next slide, please. So you can just skip that slide. Due to time, I think I'll just cruise through. Sorry, Marisa, can you skip the slide? Yes, so my presentation will give just an overview of what I'll be talking about through an introduction and background. Then I'll proceed to give an overview of the IFF's issue in the context of the extractive industry, and then present some of the key challenges that are faced around taxation in the EI sector, and then just prompt a little bit of our thinking around what reimagining or rethinking taxation in Africa's EI sector would look like. And then we will then go into looking ahead to some of the opportunities that are there for reform in the sector. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So why is this discussion important? I think, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, Africa is facing a time when resources are much needed to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as deal with the already existing challenges around poverty and inequality. The EI sector presents sort of like the cash cow to address these challenges. And we see that for Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, 62% of the total exports come from the extractive industries, particularly oil, minerals, and metals. And we see that that's a significant percent in terms of contribution to trade. This invariably means that the EI sector has a big influence on the rates of economic growth and the amount of tax collected by governments from the sector. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as has already been mentioned, I think the latest data shows us that about 89 billion is lost annually through illicit financial flows, and particularly around the extractive sector. The UNCTAD report, which was released last year, links the export of primary extractive resources estimated at 40 billion USD in 2015, and over the past decade from the year 2000 to 2020, estimated an amount of 278 billion lost just from the extractive sector. So we see an increasing trend when it comes to financial crimes in the sector. And but more specifically, IFFs are concentrated in high value, low weight commodities, especially gold, diamonds, and other precious minerals. Of the estimated 40 billion US dollars of IFFs derived from the extractive commodities, the report finds that in 2015, 77% were concentrated in the gold supply chain, followed by diamonds at 12%, and then platinum at 6%. So we see that there is a high amount of financial crime in the extractive industries, but particularly on these high value, low weight commodities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share some of the challenges that are faced when it comes to taxing this industry. And this is drawn from the work that we've done through our research and advocacy efforts through our partners, as well as ourselves at a continental level. So one of the issues that exacerbates the problem of IFFs in the EI sector is this dominance of foreign multinationals. And previous colleagues have already spoken to that from different angles, but we see that the increased participation of foreign multinationals in the sector, from exploration stage to production to exportation, exposes the sector to increased corporate tax abuses. Again, there's this unrealistic expectations, or perhaps I'll term it a misunderstanding by governments and on the long-term nature of the extractive industries. So once a project begins, how long does it take for it to materialize to a point where we start to break even, and then they can start to pay a tax on profits? A big challenge, again, that governments on the continent face is the inadequate geological information in terms of knowing the value of resources in the extractive industry. And this thereby undermines their ability to adequately design fiscal regimes that would then meet the value of what's in the sector. So usually we see, for example, governments relying on the data that multinationals present to them during exploration stage. And with that data, they then design fiscal regimes that the extractive companies would then be charged against. So we see that this presents a big challenge, because how reliable is the data that the companies submit to the government, and in ensuring that we maximize revenue collection. Poorly designed and negotiated fiscal terms in the different mining, oil and gas contracts is another big challenge, and this particularly tied to the overly generous tax incentives locked in fiscal stabilization clauses. So deals that are poorly negotiated in terms of fiscal incentives, which then undermines our DRM efforts from the sector. Another big one is the inadequate administrative capacity by revenue authorities to administer and implement these fiscal regimes. So yes, if you have a well-designed fiscal regime but lack the capacity to implement it, then you have a problem there. So this has been something that's been problematic in Africa. Next slide, please. We also see that the over-reliance of profit-based taxes in the sector exposes it to corporate tax abuses. So taxes like corporate income tax, where companies can manipulate costs, then undermines our efforts to get the most that we can in terms of taxes from the sector. Price volatility of oil, gas, and minerals can be problematic in the sense that the sector is operating in a context that is constantly evolving. So for instance, just last year, we saw the impact that COVID-19 had on oil and gas prices. We saw oil prices plummeting whilst gold prices appreciated. So then how do extractive companies continue to operate in a context like that? But also how do governments continue to maximize collection in times when prices are volatile? Policy inconsistencies is another challenge. We've seen that policies are developed on a short-term basis when the extractive industry by nature is a long-term industry. So for instance, an example I can cite here is the Zambian government that has changed its mining tax regime at least 10 times in the last 15 years. This makes it unpredictable for extractive companies to operate sustainably, but also in times of windfalls, when prices have gone up, the government then misses out, because then it's constantly shifting when it comes to the different fiscal instruments it's applying to the sector. Mistrust is a big thing. I think when it comes to taxation, trust is critical amongst the key stakeholders that are involved. And so we see that there's an increased mistrust between investors and governments, and that trust levels have been eroded over time. And this therefore affects their ability to engage meaningfully on issues around taxation in the sector. The opacity and secrecy in the signing of deals in the extractive industries is another challenge. So due to the limited to no transparency and accountability frameworks around the agreed terms between government and investors, we are asking questions about who are the true owners of those investments that are being made in the country, but also the different fiscal terms on a project-by-project basis. What are the agreed fiscal terms that have been designed, for instance, with Glencore, Vendata, and other companies? So this is a challenge that has presented itself and has sort of undermined efforts to meaningfully maximize revenue collection from the sector. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of just trying to think about what would rethinking taxation look like in Africa, particularly in the extractive industries, there's a few pointers there that I've brought in terms of looking at it holistically, but more importantly, local solutions. So next slide, please. So looking at this discussion more broadly, the question then becomes, how do we design fiscal regimes that build in elements of predictability, stability, and flexibility from the onset of this extractive project? And I think for investments to thrive, for companies to meaningfully invest in sectors, there has to be predictability or some certainty in terms of operations. So the political context, in terms of conflict, will the investors get their meaningful gains in a context that is stable and also flexible at the same time. In terms of flexibility in a fiscal regime, governments, for instance, could consider implementing sliding scales on royalties, as well as applying a tax on surplus profits to ensure a larger share is collected when commodity prices are high. And I think this we've seen recently, for example, in Southern Africa, copper producing countries like the Congo DR, as well as Zambia. We've seen that copper prices have gone up to 9,000 USD per ton. And so the question becomes, how then do you ensure that your fiscal regime is flexible enough for you to adjust in order for you to leverage off the gains of these copper prices? Governments, again, should resist offering overly generous tax incentives. If an extractive project cannot bear the royalty or normal tax on equity investment, it is unlikely to not be a good deal, because governments risk losing out when the context changes. And I think I've already alluded to this. So when you have a copper price boom, or you have new technology that increases efficiency in terms of operations, these tax incentives make governments lose out on potential revenues they could collect. Lastly, again, on this slide is governments must be very clear on what they want to achieve from the extractive industries in terms of their national development plans and priorities. Clear objectives often result in well-designed fiscal regime. And I think this goes without saying that when the objective is clear, it is easier then to set up a fiscal regime that responds to that objective. So whether it's setting up a sovereign wealth fund, or ensuring that more locals participate, or a minimum revenue sharing mechanism there, termed as MRS, it's very critical that governments have clear priorities that then enables them to design fiscal regimes that responds to those development plans and priorities. Next slide, please. Okay, so now this slide focuses more on the local solutions. So in terms of looking at policy and regulatory frameworks, I think it's important that Africa got to a point where we started to develop more homegrown models and solutions to taxing our industry. And conversations need to move from taxing raw materials to taxing value. Frameworks like the AMV present a very good opportunity for us to move in that direction. And so domesticating the Africa mining vision, which is a vision that really promotes Africa-driven solutions in the extractive industries, to domesticate this vision to country mining level. Local content is another big discussion. So beyond taxing, beyond talking taxation, can the extractive industry provide direct linkages to the local economy? Mining projects must be rooted in the local economy to provide spillover effects to other sectors such as banking, insurance, transportation, warehousing, security, and processing. And this then ensures that locals benefit from the sector. Artisanal and small-scale mining is another big piece of the discussion when we look at locally driven solutions. So formalizing of the sector becomes important because it presents a huge opportunity to maximize revenue collection in-house, as well as encourages the participation of local players. So for example, how do we ensure that local players benefit from emeralds that can be polished to make rings that can then be sold in their finished product to the international markets? And the Africa Continental Free Trade Area deal, which was recently enacted, really presents a great opportunity for Africa to leverage off this. Again, how do we incentivize local participation, especially the women in mining, to participate in the sector? And there, again, the issue of taxation comes into play in designing fiscal regime that accommodates the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. I think what we've seen in some countries is that the same fiscal regime that applies to large-scale companies is the one that applies also to small-scale players. Now that, in terms of encouraging participation, is retrogressive. So how do we encourage governments to develop fiscal regimes that are nuanced and specific for artisanal and small-scale players, but also for the large-scale players? Next slide, please.
Makupa, sorry to interrupt. We're not doing so well with time. So if you could wrap up in a minute.
Okay, no problem. I'll rush through these next slides. Basically, please, next slide, please. basically in looking at the opportunities ahead, I think the discussion then becomes, how do you ensure that the awarding of extractive projects is done in a transparent and competitive manner? Because poor governance results in effective tax regimes that are developed, but also, again, the issue of trust and building consensus between the key stakeholders, which is private sector, government, and civil society. The EITI there presents a great opportunity. The discussion on the energy transition and how governments can pre-position themselves to maximize collection. We've noted countries like Congo DR have decided to review their current contracts to ensure that they look into this. So how do we ensure that the energy transition works for us in terms of maximizing collection? Next slide, please. The increasing role of China becomes an important discussion in the extractive industries. So we've seen China increasingly taking over many projects on the continent. What does this mean for the transparency and accountability discussion? And how then again do we deal with issues to do with contract transparency and secrecy? The tax policy reform processes, which are mostly northern driven, the G7 OECD tax proposals, for instance, and the energy transition discussions, which are mostly northern driven. So again, as Africa, how do we find ourselves sitting at the table in these conversations to ensure that we meaningfully benefit from the overall tax system? Next slide, please. So lastly, basically, as a tax justice movement, I think for us, our core is to ensure that mining works for the local people, and local people here is Africa. So we have a great opportunity ahead to ensure that mining works for us through frameworks like the Africa Mining Vision, the EITI, but also keeping in mind that extractive resources are finite and non-renewable. And so if we don't benefit now, there'll never be a time for us to address our poverty and inequality challenges. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you very much, Mukupa. Thank you for such a very detailed presentation on a very important topic. I think one takeaway from me is what you highlighted, the need to have very clear objectives in terms of what you want your extractive industry and the revenues and resources you generate from there to achieve for a country. You look at countries, my country, Nigeria, over the decades, it's not entirely clear. And I mean, from Alex's presentation, you could see that the opportunity cost in terms of not administering the extractive industry properly is that it exacerbates inequality. It has a lot of negative implications for development. But if you go to countries like the UAE, you'd see that, I mean, they have their negatives, but in terms of what they've done with the extractive industry, you'd see that the extractive does not constitute a huge portion of the public expenditure, public revenue. So I think that this is a very important point for us to take away. So we are not doing so well with time, so we'll take a few questions. The first question here is for Alex. I'll just read it out. How does transfer pricing abuses deny the basic economic, social, and cultural rights for African countries?
Just quickly, I'd say that there are 4 R's of taxation, and the 4 R's basically say, why do you even impose tax in the first instance? One is to raise revenue, the other is to reprice commodity, the third is to redistribute wealth, and the fourth is to reform behavior. Now, transfer pricing abuses would affect 2 of those R's, which tie to the economic, social, and cultural rights that you mentioned. The first is that when there are transfer pricing abuses, they are not able to raise revenue, and then that way it affects the economy of African countries. But the other important one, really, I mean, 2 other important, to redistribute wealth, which again we could overlook, but the more important one, which goes to both social and cultural rights, will be the issue of behavior, right? The moment I know that someone is not paying taxes, because we all believe in fairness as part of our culture and also our social values, what would happen also is that voluntary tax compliance becomes difficult. We tend to learn a lot from our neighbors. And so if people are aware that multinational entities who should pay taxes, who have the ability to pay taxes, are not paying taxes, then you find justification. And when you look at papers by Neil McCulloch and guys who have looked at the reasons behind voluntary non-tax compliance in many African countries, one of the reasons goes to the to the fact that there are people who don't pay taxes, whether they are high net worth individuals, whether they're multinational entities, and as such, others think that they shouldn't pay taxes. So you sort of have that connection between the 4 R's of taxation and the sort of the economic, social, and cultural rights of African countries, and how they sort of marry in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Unfortunately, we may not be able to take. Maybe we'll take just one. We'll take just one, and then the other questions, maybe the speakers can look through the chats and reply directly. Let me see which one is. So Joy, one question is, what do you think about country technologies meant to combat IFF? And I think this will speak to your experience dealing with different countries in interagency, intercountry cooperation.
I was just reading this question and thinking about it actually. And I think I have to contextualize it, but I also have to put a caveat on it. One is that, the way that technology emerges is mainly by creation of the private sector. And so we cannot really say that they are meant to combat IFFs, right? What we can say is that we are innovating to use the technology that's emerging to combat IFF. So we're using it for data management. We are creating new means and methods, right? But I think I want to contextualize your question because it's an important point within it. Currently at the WTO, you have the e-commerce negotiations going on, and that's the plurilateral. And they are currently deciding about the rules of transfer of technology, for example, or localization of content relating to technology, the ability of countries to demand that a company using certain technology has, for example, their data centers based in your country. And it's important to have the data centers or to be able to access the what's behind the ownership of a specific type of software. So you can look behind it and see the original creator or who has contributed and created value. And these are very important, not just about combating IFFs, it's also about taxation, because if you're able to track or see where value is being created, where maybe Nigeria, South Africa, they contributed to the creation of this software, then there may be a right to tax, even if there's no physical presence attached to this right. So indeed, what's happening is not a monopolizing of technology, it's almost a monopolizing of ownership and the way this technology can be transferred and adapted or adopted. And I think it's very important that we begin to engage in this debate that's going on at the WTO level. And I do believe it will become a concern for the CFTA as well, is how we want to treat e-commerce and how we want to treat the use of technology, the transfer of technology. So indeed, that's a very important question. I encourage everyone to get engaged. The Africa group at the WTO have expressed that they are not happy with this this agreement for very many reasons, including that no one is actually prepared to know, use and widely use and adopt technology across the continent right now. And so it would not make sense to adopt these e-commerce negotiations if we don't know the implications as yet. Very much like the Doha round, there's the developing versus the developed countries. So it's a very important question, and I encourage everyone to engage in that debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end to this very, very interesting session filled with stellar cast speakers, like I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much to the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crimes for hosting this session, to the very wonderful speakers, Joy, Alex. Thank you very much. I hand over to Folashade.
Thank you so much. And just to thank our moderators and all of our speakers in the last two sessions. Your presentations have been very, very insightful. We apologize that we've run over slightly, so we are going to now break out for lunch. So lunch will be from 12:30 to 1 p.m. and then we will continue with our next session, which I'm happy to be moderating on whistleblower protection in Africa. Please could I ask that everybody please remain logged into Zoom, just turn off your cameras and mute your mics, because if you log out, you'll have to log in again, and then you'll be sent to the waiting room for you to be able to come in that way. So we will be starting at 1 p.m.